Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to talk about the rise of American prosperity in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the United States became the sole hegemonic power, and we felt like we had almost unlimited ability to project our power and influence, but we also came right up against the limits of that ability. So, here are our objectives for today. Let's take a moment and dive in. Clintons were to some degree moderate Democrats. And as you hopefully remember, in 1994, we saw Republicans sweep back in with Newt Gingrich and his contract with America, kicking off an era of divided government. So, despite Clinton campaigning on promises to reduce taxes, in the end, he's going to try to tackle budget deficits. He's going to raise taxes, balance budgets, and we're going to see a massive era of economic growth because of increased technology that's going to lead to the first surpluses that we're really going to see, first sustained surpluses that we've seen in a generation. This really means that the United States is on solid financial footing for the first time in a long time. And there was really a plan to try to pay off the deficit or to end deficits and to pay off the national debt by like the 2020s. Obviously, we didn't end up going that direction for a whole host of different reasons that we're going to get into. But especially the last years of the 1990s, we see huge budget surpluses that are being used to pay down the debt. And there's a real feeling that the United States might be on a path to financial security. We also see NAFTA pass during this time period. The North American Free Trade Agreement was signed between the US, Canada, and Mexico. This had a number of different effects, of course, significantly increasing the growth of the US and Mexico and Canada's economy, and had some negative effects. So for the positives, NAFTA did lead to massive economic growth, lower prices for consumers, and a higher standard of living. But it did also lead to some outsourcing as companies were more easily able to shift production to places like Mexico. So, like all of these free trade agreements, it benefits US society as a whole, but hits specific industries and specific groups of people who are generally hurt by outsourcing. It did not lead to the catastrophic giant sucking of jobs that Ross Perot predicted in his third-party challenges, and it's certainly not the worst trade deal ever negotiated. It definitely led to some economic growth, although there are some ways that you could criticize NAFTA legitimately. So here's Clinton's explanation for NAFTA. So take a minute, pause, and read, and let's move forward. In the end, without the Soviet Union, the United States is now the unipolar hegemon of the world. We are the last remaining superpower, and we've really felt like we had the ability to project power unlimitedly. We've still got this massive military that's able to deploy troops and influence policies around the world at a moment's notice. And the fact that us and Russia start developing a closer relationship really felt like maybe this whole new world order thing is going to allow an era of peace and prosperity around the world. Clinton attempted to push the Oslo Accords, which was the first time in which we really saw Israel and the Palestinians sit down and try to hammer out a peace deal. Israel at least recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization, something which it had not done previously. But these talks were unable to establish a lasting peace, despite the handshake here between the leaders of Israel and the PLO. And in the end, the Israel problem is still one that remains a thorn in the side of U.S. Middle Eastern politics and, honestly, stability in the Middle East. So the Oslo Accords were an attempt to solve this problem, but they did not produce a lasting solution. In the Balkans, the collapse of Yugoslavia led to ethnic cleansing and significant instability. The US, in order to attempt to protect specifically Bosnian Muslim refugees, ended up sending in a carrier group and had some airstrikes in order to depose the former Yugoslavian president Slobodan Milosevic and cut down on the amount of tension in Yugoslavia. This was somewhat successful despite the fact that there was significant sectarian violence and the area would remain relatively unstable in the aftermath of the collapse of Yugoslavia. So the Balkans represent somewhat of a success of U.S. foreign policy. In Africa, however, we're really going to struggle. A famine in Somalia led the US to send in troops in order to try to deal with some Somalian warlords who had been taking and redistributing UN supplies. So these warlords specifically, created their whole network by distributing drugs to their followers and then seized control of supplies of food. The US launched an attempt to capture one of these warlords, and unfortunately, the prevalence of rocket propelled grenades led to the shooting down of a US Black Hawk helicopter and several American deaths. It also led to a shootout along the streets of Mogadishu in Somalia. And this whole disaster playing out on international news with both dead Americans and significant civilian casualties led the United States to be much more hesitant to try to intervene in Africa. Here's Bill Clinton's address on Somalia. So take a moment, pause, and read. And in the end, the long-term effect of this is we were slow to respond to a genocide in Rwanda, which is incredibly complicated, and I'm not going to get into in detail here. But just know that the Rwandan genocide, the United States was very slow to respond. And honestly, the world was relatively slow to respond to the Rwandan genocide. And the human toll was absolutely stunning and horrifying. We also see a rise in terrorism. The shooting down of a plane by Libyan terrorists over Scotland caused significant loss of life. And the Oklahoma City bombing was a huge act of domestic terrorism by Timothy McVeigh, who was retaliating for what he saw as U.S. government overreach from things like the Waco standoff, which, again, if you're interested in this, there's endless resources out there that you can do a deep dive on the whole Waco and the Branch Davidians. But in the end, we're seeing both the rise of foreign terrorism, for example, the shooting down of a Pan Am flight, and domestic terrorism like the Oklahoma City bombing. This is becoming an increasing problem for the United States. There was also an attempt to bomb the World Trade Center. A bomb went off in the parking garage of the World Trade Center, but did not lead to substantial damage. And so all of this is going to become an increasing issue throughout the 1990s. Clinton, after the Oklahoma City bombing, was one of Clinton's best moments. He gave this speech, The Time for Healing. So take a moment, pause, and read, and then we'll move forward. We also see a rise in school violence during this era, most famously the Columbine shooting in the late 1990s, where two students opened fire in their high school in Littleton, Colorado, created an atmosphere of fear within education and the beginning of evacuation drills, lockdown drills, and other sort of attempts to keep students safe in these sort of school environments. And so that's another problem that started in the late 1990s and is continuing to plague us to this day. The election of 1996, Clinton was relatively popular. He was challenged by Kansas Republican Bob Dole. And again, Ross Perot is going to play a huge role in the campaign, running his third-party candidacy through his Reform Party. So Clinton is to some degree running on the strength of the economy. Bob Dole is running on his long-serving history in politics. In general, the economic growth for Clinton is what really fueled his rise and took a lot of the wind from Ross Perot's sails this time. Also, the failure of NAFTA to create this sort of disastrous situation in the United States, as Ross Perot predicted, really cut down on Ross Perot's support. Although he did get 8 million votes, here you can see here, Clinton won almost 50% of the popular vote, 70% of the electoral vote, and coasted to a relatively easy re-election in 1996. The rise of the internet in the late 1990s is going to really increase the amount of communication and coordination between various different businesses and individuals. Things like email sound are really commonplace to us today and seem almost archaic. But in the 1990s, the speed of communication that the internet provided was really unprecedented and really allowed people to communicate and connect much easier than ever before. Obviously, the invention of the web browser, allowing you to go to websites that people would host on the internet, again, seems almost quaint to us today. But at the time, this access to information greatly expanded the amount of information that people could have and created an entire new world of internet service providers and other, sort of systems. Admittedly, dial-up internet was pretty slow at the time. And, if you were trying to illegally download songs and your parents happened to pick up the phone, they would get angry at you both for, using up the phone line, but it would also interrupt your 30-minute download and you'd have to start over, again when they weren't paying attention. Not that that's something I ever experienced. Tech companies are going to grow substantially in value during the late 1990s, creating this bubble as venture capitalists try to invest in these new internet companies to create content with the hope that they could eventually monetize it. This bubble would eventually lead to a crash in the early 2000s, which we'll talk about when we get in the next lesson. But for right now, what we're seeing is a substantial growth and hope and optimism in the late 1990s as the internet seems like a place in which anything might be possible. So that's very exciting. The last thing that we have for Clinton is the sex scandal. Clinton had been tied to a number of different sexual harassment cases, and the ongoing Whitewater investigation had really dogged his presidency, although it really hadn't affected his popularity with the general public. But over the course of this whole deposition, a lady named Paula Jones revealed that Clinton might have had a relationship with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. Clinton famously went on television and assured us that he did not have sexual relations with that woman. And so if you've never seen if you've never seen the famous Clinton statement, definitely go and watch that. We're not going to watch it here. Yeah, you should be familiar with this. Very clearly said, did not have sexual relations with this woman and did not tell anyone to lie. And then it turns out it really depends on your definition of sexual relations and your definition of the word the. And did he tell anyone to lie? Man, that's a complicated statement to try to prove. In the end, it's going to lead to a larger investigation into the president, and it's going to lead to impeachment charges brought against Bill Clinton for his attempt to cover up and potentially perjure himself about this whole affair that he had with Monica Lewinsky. In general, unfortunately for the Republicans bringing the investigation, the votes were not there to acquit Bill Clinton, or to impeach or to convict Bill Clinton, and so he was acquitted on all charges, and the American public generally did not support the impeachment movement, and it led to the hurting of the Republicans who pushed this whole model. Clinton's popularity skyrocketed despite all of this because the economy was good, and the attempt to impeach and remove the president was politically damaging in general. So here we see the vote to impeach, which was not even the vote to acquit, which was not even a purely party line vote. And so in the end, Clinton is going to escape with the indignity. With being the notoriety of being one of only a few presidents to be impeached, but of course not removed from office, and certainly not even close to convicted. And even all Republicans did not necessarily support the charges, which in these days seems pretty outrageous and unlikely. And so that brings us to the conclusion of the Clinton years. It's an era of hope and prosperity where we thought anything might be possible. So we're going to talk next time about the election of 2000, the election of George Bush, and how American society really transformed once we got past September 11th, 2001. For now, thank you.